I grew up in the suburbs of Montreal in a single-family home that my parents bought in 1979, the year before I was born, to raise their young family in. I didn't know much about downtown Montreal as a kid. We mostly just drove to the mall or the local strip centers for most of my family's commercial needs. Today I live in the Mile End neighborhood of Montreal. My neighbors include an 80-year-old Greek man named Theo, a German PhD student studying quantum physics. There's a musician and his fashion designer girlfriend down the hall. Across the alley in back of me, there's a young family with 2 young kids, probably not that dissimilar to my parents 34 years ago when they bought their first home in the suburbs. I can step out my front door, and I am in the center of some of the best restaurants and cafes in the whole city. Yoga studios, the grocery stores across the street. I can throw in my running shoes. I'm on Mount Royal, Montreal's Central Park, in about 5 minutes. Or I can walk around the street and hop on a Bixi, Montreal's public bike system, and bike the 15 minutes to my office in Old Montreal. I live in an intergenerational, diverse, multicultural, mixed-use urban village that affords me an incredible quality of life. It's also one of the most creative and dynamic neighborhoods in the country, if not the continent. Arcade Fire, Grammy Award-winning indie band, they're from Mile End. But before my neighborhood was producing the likes of the Arcade Fire, it produced my father. He was born into an apartment not a half block from where I live today, except in 1948, Mile End was an urban immigrant neighborhood of Montreal that my grandparents, who both immigrated from Eastern Europe, got out of as quickly as they could and had enough money to buy a house in the suburbs. Because that was the dream back then. Single-family home, great family life, hop in your car every day, drive to work in the city on a highway in the sky. But as we know, it didn't quite turn out like that. The average American spends about 50 hours a week stuck in traffic, 50 hours not spent with their families. If you add up all the roads and highways and parking lots in the United States, America's paved an area larger than the state of Georgia. I'm here today to talk to you about some of the trends that are making our cities vibrant and more livable again. And I'm going to show you that many of these new ideas, these new trends, aren't really new at all. They're based on age-old concepts that are finally putting our fundamental desires and needs as human beings back at the forefront of our thinking about urban development. We're returning to mixed-use places and valuing them again. But what does that mean? We have to understand where they come from, because most cities started off as small villages or settlements. And in the village, you lived near where you worked, near where you went to school, near the store, near your friends, where you recreated, where you grew your food, mostly out of necessity because there were no cars and you had to walk everywhere. And this worked on a slightly larger scale as some of those villages grew up into small towns and cities. But as industrialization took hold and cities got crowded, people started crowding into cities, uses and use started encroaching upon one another, and we started passing laws about what you could and could not do, and those weren't always well motivated. San Francisco in 1885 tried to pass a law banning public laundries, which was really just a veiled attempt to zone out the Chinese, who were seen as undesirable neighbors and ran the majority of those businesses. And as technology improved, we started regulating what we could build. In 1915, the Equitable Building went up in Lower Manhattan, rising 44 stories without setbacks from the street, and virtually cut off natural light to the street level in many of the surrounding buildings. New York passed the first comprehensive zoning code in the United States the following year. And as mobility improved, you could finally separate people from jobs. So if you had enough money, you could live in one part of the city, hop on the streetcar, and drive to work in another. And over the course of the next 100 years, we divided up every acre of the country on the continent into small little colored zones with clearly defined rules about what you could and could not do with your land. Anyone here ever been to Washington, D.C.? Show of hands. You ever been to any of these neighborhoods? Okay, what if I told you that if they didn't exist today already, that you couldn't legally build them? Why? Well, not enough parking, That building, it's not set back from the street. And that road is too narrow. You can't get a fire truck down it. And that's a residential building. Why is there a restaurant on the ground floor? And what are those people doing sitting outside enjoying a meal on a public sidewalk? Now, it's funny, but it's not so funny, because the vast majority of North America didn't have an urban form dating back to the 19th century. So all the development that happened post-war never stood a chance. You couldn't build these places again. You weren't allowed. Mixed-use places have mom-and-pop businesses at the core of their places. And as we've talked about, zoning rules have now changed. The city of Washington is nearing the end of a 5-year process of fixing its zoning code. And those rules are largely being informed by trying to bring back the historic qualities of those mixed-use places that fell out of favor and got regulated out of existence. And at the core of all of our favorite places and neighborhoods are great mom-and-pop operators. Now, historically, owner-operated businesses were the lifeblood of communities, because beyond the provision of goods and services, they offered a place where people developed a sense of identity for their communities. They knew your name, they knew your family. Business was personal, and they were a part of people's lives. As suburban expansion took over, the shopping mall gradually usurped downtowns and main streets as the centers of commercial activity for most communities. And as we know, shopping malls are largely populated by large national and retail tenants, not the small businesses of old. And that struck a devastating blow to the downtowns and main streets across North America, because as these businesses closed and as the economy got sucked out of them and left for the suburbs, many communities lost their sense of identity and the social cohesion that these downtowns and main streets used to provide. But as we know, things always come full circle. In the aftermath of the economic downturn, after decades of rapid expansion, national retailing started to decline. These are just some of the businesses that either went bankrupt or downsized significantly in the aftermath of the Great Recession. Does anyone recognize this cafe? That's a Starbucks. In 2008, Starbucks closed 600 stores, 600. Figuring there may be some room to improve their business model, in 2009, they embarked on a process of rebranding 2 of their locations in their hometown of Seattle, Washington. And they completely overhauled them to look and operate and feel like a locally owned neighborhood cafe. Now, why is that significant? Starbucks is one of the most recognizable and valuable brands in the world. And they realized that their brand equity, that brand recognition, was actually potentially a liability in some regard. It was an overt recognition of their belief that consumer preferences were shifting back to a desire for customization and personalized commercial experiences, which, as we know, is the traditional domain of the mom-and-pop operator. But these new mom-and-pops have some new wrinkles to them, partially fed by lack of work opportunities due to the economy, people losing their jobs, people entering a workforce without the same prospects of traditional employment. There's a new spirit of entrepreneurship, and people making a go of it on their own. And beyond that, this generation of entrepreneurs has access to the internet, which has given them access to vast markets that never used to be accessible from a single geographic location. And social media and other online platforms have given them the tools to tell their story and connect with their customers across geographic boundaries in a way that you never could historically. Our cities are getting greener in a few different ways, and I'm going to start by talking about urban agriculture, which is apt after the video we just watched. And I'll be the first to admit that when I used to think about urban agriculture, this is kind of the image that used to come to mind. But as we know, urban agriculture is changing. If you're lucky enough to get a reservation at Joe Beef, one of Montreal's best restaurants, on a really nice evening in the summertime, you can sit back on their terrace, secure in the knowledge that the lettuce in your salad and the herbs garnishing your food were likely picked only moments before they landed on your plate from the garden right next to your table. Farmers markets are booming. They're everywhere you look. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has seen over a 5-fold increase in registered farmers market, let alone unregistered ones, in the last 18 years. Urban agriculture seems like a great idea, like it's this big new concept that we finally figured out makes a lot of sense, growing food in cities. But the truth is, it's been a part of human cities since the beginnings of human settlement, for a pretty simple reason. In the days before modern food distribution networks and processed foods and preservatives, if you didn't grow food really close to the people who needed to eat it, it went bad. When William Penn set out his plan for the city of Philadelphia in 1643, every home was to have its own garden. And this was a revolutionary concept at the time, and it was a reaction to what he saw as the increasingly crowded cities of Europe, mostly London and Paris, that were struggling with the subpar living conditions associated with industrialization. And he knew that mandating green space on private land was a way to ensure that his city would have a higher quality of life. And urban agriculture has been a part of North America, even the turn of the 20th century. It provided food security for poor urban neighborhoods, many in New York and Boston at the turn of the century and into the Great Depression. And victory gardens, as they came to be known, helped feed American cities during the Second World War. Now, the problem is that despite the great history of urban agriculture, it largely operated without any official sanction for most of its history. Despite its founding vision, the Philadelphia Planning Commission didn't even recognize urban agriculture as a legal land use until it rewrote its zoning code last year. But now it does, and so do many other places, and that has incredible implications for the future of growing food in our cities and how you deal with issues like food deserts and affording people access to healthy food. The benefits of access to green space are unequivocal. Environmentally, they help filter stormwater, they clean our air, they reduce the urban heat island effect, and from a health standpoint, they're associated with the reduction of stress, longevity. It helps you live longer to be near parks. And get this, they've even found that people who are recovering from injury or illness, who can look out a window and see trees, just see them, will heal faster than those who can't. So there are incredible economic and social benefits to having green cities. The challenge is that we've largely left that responsibility to our municipal entities, who are supposed to provide us with public parks and landscape our public spaces. But as we know, most of the land in our cities is privately owned. And so there's a change in thinking afoot. Washington, D.C. is on the cusp of becoming only the second city in North America to adopt what's called a green area ratio. It's a concept that basically says that any new development has to apportion a certain percentage of its lot area to green space. And that can be on the ground, it can be on the roof, it doesn't matter. It's a decentralized approach that's based on the idea that every citizen and every private landowner has a duty and a responsibility to make our cities healthier, greener, and more livable. And it's a pretty revolutionary idea, I think. But if you stop for a sec, it's really just William Penn's vision coming full circle. Now, all of these ideas really come down to a pretty simple guiding principle. That cities need to be for people first. Because if cities thrive, and people that thrive in them will help their cities thrive. And people really aren't that different. By 2050, 75% of the world's population will live in cities. In 1983, it was 25%. And as our cities continue to grow and grow more diverse, successful places of the future are the ones that will offer people the opportunities to both express and explore their individuality while catering to their common humanity. Civic pride has returned in droves. Anywhere USA, generic homogeneous places, that just doesn't cut it anymore. People have awoken again to valuing a culture and an economy that is particular to a place and are taking deliberate steps to promote and safeguard their civic identities. In 2010, a group of leading network scientists at Northeastern University studied the mobility patterns of over 50,000 anonymous cell phone users. And they concluded that human behavior is 93% predictable. 93%. And there were no significant variations across age or gender or income levels or even urban or rural dwellers. It was across the board. We're all fundamentally creatures of habit. And the things that motivate us and influence our success and our happiness and our personal fulfillment remain fundamentally unchanged across millennia. We have the same desires as we've always had: to eat, to socialize, to engage in commerce, to be entertained, to recreate and access nature, to connect to one another, and to seek meaning. And we thrive most when we can do all of those things in one convenient place. Car ownership is declining in the developed world for the first time in history. So in this new world for a new generation, where freedom now means not owning a car, when you think about it, we're really just back to the village, or a modern version of it. Thank you very much.